As BRICS leaders meet in Johannesburg this week, the threat of a worsening global trade war will undoubtedly top the agenda. Now, the urgency to promote intra-BRICS trade has become increasingly important as we see the global status quo changing. Now, earlier this month, China said its plan is to step up cooperation with other developing nations, and that's to counter trade protectionism. Well, we asked Ian Cruickshanks, who's the chief economist at the South African Institute of Race Relations, just how important the grouping is to the continent today.
We've got to look at BRICS solutions for BRICS problems and BRICS challenges. We've got to look within the group instead of just always looking outside and looking for outside assistance. You know, we must remember, just to start with, that China-South Africa trade is quite considerable. The Chinese have already invested $25 billion in South Africa. We need to concentrate on growing this, perhaps not only on bilateral but on group trade agreements, and I think that is where there's a big benefit for South Africa and for the other lesser developed countries in the BRICS group to benefit from the access to capital, access to technology, access to expertise, project management, education, to people who have numerate abilities. There's a lot to be gained from there by the lesser developed countries, and from the better developed, more developed countries. There's also, of course, the factor of access to minerals, access to resources which we can offer. So I think there's a lot of joint operations, and we must concentrate on these joint operations on a bilateral basis, which can be to both our benefits to a considerable extent.
Now, we did mention earlier that South Africa is actually the smallest of the BRICS economies, but the rest of Africa is sort of looking to South Africa as the gateway to the continent. What, for you, are the key issues we need to see South Africa pushing at this summit on behalf of the African continent?
I think what we have to say is, you know, there's a continent of billions of people, I think it's 6 billion people, huge, hardly developed consumer markets which countries like China and India could easily exploit, and I think that could be concentrated on. And I think also the fact that South Africa is, in fact, from a geographic point of view, the natural gateway to Africa, but we've got to recognize our size in the global sphere. You know, the continent itself is only 3% of global trade. South Africa itself is 0.7% of global trade. So we're going to have to realize we're up against some big bargainers, and it'll be difficult to make individual progress, but we've got to make a start. We've got to declare what we're good at doing. You know, for instance, in the mining sector, we're good at accessing minerals, at delivering them to our outgoing ports, and in that sort of way we can see a benefit from the international companies that operate in China and India and Russia, and to gain from the access to African mineral resources. There's a lot to be looked at there.
Now, it's only a matter of hours before the 10th annual BRICS summit kicks off in South Africa. As we mentioned, leaders of Brazil, Russia, India and China, as well as South Africa, will be meeting against the backdrop of increasingly uncertain times in global trade, with, of course, the U.S. making aggressive moves to protect its own market. Well, Sumitra Naidu takes a look at how trade is faring within the BRICS grouping.
Intra-BRICS trade grew from $567 billion in 2010 to $740 billion in 2017. But it seems China is the key participant here.
It's all about trade with China largely, if you look at what goes on within BRICS trade patterns. The other 4 countries trade a lot with China. That hasn't changed. Where we have seen some growth, for example, in the context of South Africa, has been in our trade with India, but not with Brazil and Russia necessarily.
Leaving China to lead the way could cause more upheaval for other countries in the grouping that are struggling with weak economies. US President Donald Trump's insistence on protectionist policies could have a serious impact on the global economy. Emerging markets are already feeling the pain. Increased intra-BRICS trade could offset these losses.
If you've got a slowdown in your economy overall, then you're not really going to be able to take full advantage of engagements with coalitions such as BRICS. So we've seen that in Brazil, we've seen that in South Africa as well.
South Africa BRIC trade has been sluggish, having lifted from just $28 billion in 2010 to $35 billion in 2017. China and India remain the most robust economies within BRICS and in the world. Brazil, Russia and South Africa are still lagging way behind. But BRICS trade ministers recently agreed to expand industrial and economic cooperation and better policy coordination under the new industrial revolution.
There's very interesting developments on the commerce side, on things like policy coordination, looking at tariffs that are charged between BRICS, for import and export of goods. Very tangible, very specific things that the trade ministers are looking at, like, for example, between export credit agencies, the trade in national currencies, which also very significant, that basically BRICS nations are increasingly cutting out the US dollar as a global trading currency, which opens new possibilities, for us in terms of our trading relationship.
The BRICS New Development Bank has already made financing available for several projects that will improve infrastructure and the movement of goods and services. The aim is to work towards a BRICS free trade deal, which may come in the long term only after there's more of a trade balance between the 5 countries. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.